Racist cop tackles black woman. She's the mayor in disguise. They say the greatest revelations come when no one's watching. That was certainly true one cloudy afternoon in Chicago, when a routine stop spiraled into chaos. A brash police officer, fueled by bias, singled out a young black woman, certain she was up to no good. What he didn't realize? This unassuming figure was actually the mayor of America's third largest city, incognito to experience life on the streets she governed. The moment he tackled her to the ground, ignited a whirlwind that would rock City Hall, expose hidden agendas, and redefine justice. Brace yourself for a twisting journey of power, prejudice, and long overdue karma. Chicago's towering skyline shimmered in the pale mid-afternoon light. Beneath the lofty spires of Willis Tower and the bustling crowds of Michigan Avenue lay a city of contradictions, prosperous in its grandeur, yet riddled with age-old inequities. On that day, Ebony King, the city's newly elected mayor, yearned to see another side of her realm. Though Ebony was known for her polished demeanor, a fixture in tailored suits and elegant hairstyles, today she wore a simple hoodie, distressed jeans, and sneakers. A loose baseball cap concealed most of her braided hair. She wanted to blend into the mass of everyday Chicagoans. Crime issues, police relations, and growing community distrust had become hot-button topics since she took office. She believed the best way to fix a broken system was to see it up close, without the fanfare and protective detail. Leaving her security team and official car behind at a discreet parking garage, Ebony ventured out on foot. She planned to walk through neighborhoods that seldom appeared in tourist brochures, places with proud histories but battered by economic downturns and complicated relationships with law enforcement. She had no idea that by day's end, her city would be rocked by an event so explosive it would define her legacy. A few miles away, Officer Derek Mulligan was cruising down South State Street in a squad car that had seen better days. Mulligan was a seasoned officer, but not in the best sense. He prided himself on being street smart, though his colleagues knew him for a laundry list of civilian complaints, mostly from Black and Latino residents. He'd never faced serious consequences, thanks to union connections and a senior captain who viewed Mulligan's aggression as tough policing. That afternoon, Mulligan felt the simmering frustration that came from a slow shift. He had pulled over 3 cars, all of which turned out to have valid documentation and no suspicious drivers. He thrived on adrenaline, the rush of confrontation, and felt disgruntled that the day had offered him nothing but polite compliance. When he turned onto a quieter residential street, his eyes zeroed in on a lone figure walking with an air of quiet confidence. From a distance, Ebony's hoodie, jeans, and purposeful stride triggered Mulligan's prejudiced radar. What's she doing out here alone, she thought. He resolved to find out, convinced he could smell trouble. The conversation, if it could be called that, was about to turn a routine patrol into a citywide scandal. Unaware that she was being watched, Ebony strolled past a row of shuttered shops. She paused at a faded mural depicting Chicago's cultural icons, figures like Ida B. Wells and Muddy Waters. The paint had chipped, but the spirit remained. It reminded Ebony why she'd run for mayor, to uplift neighborhoods that struggled, preserve cultural heritage, and address systemic injustices. She tapped notes on her phone. Vacant storefront needs redevelopment. Check local grants for small businesses. She planned to propose an initiative to transform these deserted spaces into community-led ventures. No fancy planters or high-end boutiques for tourists, but real, sustainable change for the people who already lived here. Just as Ebony finished writing, she heard the squeal of tires behind her. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw the police cruiser pull up. I can't blow my cover now, she thought. Staying in character as an ordinary citizen, she kept walking, heart pounding with both curiosity and a slight twinge of anxiety. In the distance, Mulligan stepped out of his car. His hand hovered near his holster. Ebony felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't intended to test policing so directly, but the test had come for her. "Hey, you there?" Mulligan shouted, striding across the cracked sidewalk. Ebony turned, feigning mild surprise. The officer's posture was rigid, suspicious. Without identifying himself, he barked, "What are you doing around here?" Ebony lifted an eyebrow. "Just walking." "Is that a problem?" she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "A problem if you're up to no good," Mulligan retorted. He appraised her hoodie and the slight bulge of her phone in the front pocket, as though searching for contraband. "Let me see some ID." A mixture of nerves and indignation roiled within Ebony. As mayor, she knew her rights. But she'd decided to remain incognito, though for how long, she wasn't sure. "Why do you need my ID?" "I haven't committed a crime." Mulligan's lip curled. "You're in a high-crime area. We've had calls about suspicious individuals. Hand over your ID now, or I'll make you." Ebony hesitated. She could either comply and let the officer see her name blowing her cover instantly, or stand her ground. She chose the latter, stepping back. "I'm not doing anything illegal, officer." The tension in the air thickened. Mulligan's eyes narrowed, zeroing in on Ebony as if she were a target. He repeated his demand, voice laced with threat. Ebony swallowed. This was exactly the sort of harassment she'd vowed to address. Little did Mulligan realize he was on the cusp of committing his biggest mistake yet. Mulligan's patience snapped. With a sudden lunge, he reached for Ebony's arm. She instinctively jerked away, alarmed. "Stop!" she exclaimed, voice quivering with a mix of anger and fear. "You have no right!" But Mulligan had already decided she was a threat. Before Ebony could fully process the escalation, he tackled her to the ground. The impact was jarring her shoulder, slammed into the concrete, and a sharp jolt of pain shot up her arm. A swirl of dust rose as they struggled. Pedestrians at the far end of the block froze, some pulling out phones to record. One woman yelled, "Hey, let her go!" But Mulligan ignored the protests, forcing Ebony's wrists behind her back. Gasping, Ebony felt a surge of rage and disbelief. She never dreamed she'd experience such violence firsthand, especially as mayor. Yet she also recognized that many citizens faced this every day. Her office received countless complaints about excessive force. "Stay down!" Mulligan growled, pressing a knee onto Ebony's back. She winced, cheeks grinding against the rough sidewalk. At last, in a desperate move to avoid further harm, Ebony blurted, "I'm Mayor Ebony King." "You're making a huge mistake." For a second, Mulligan paused. Then he let out a derisive laugh. "You? Mayor Ebony King? Yeah, right. And I'm the governor." "Shut up." Phones continued filming. The city was about to witness the truth behind their uniformed protector, and he was about to learn that ignorance and prejudice can have catastrophic costs. The commotion drew more onlookers. Some shouted at Mulligan to get off Ebony. Others demanded to know what she'd done to deserve this. A teenage boy rushed forward with his phone, capturing every angle. "She didn't do nothing," he cried. Sirens whined in the distance, police backup, perhaps triggered by Mulligan's radio call for resisting suspect. Ebony, pinned to the ground, felt her heart race with a mix of fury and vulnerability. She was the highest elected official in this city, yet at that moment she was completely powerless under the crushing force of a single officer's knee. Mulligan rested Ebony's wrists into handcuffs, ignoring her repeated declarations of identity. "Thought you'd lie your way out?" he scoffed. "I've heard it all before, saying you're some big shot. I'm not falling for it." The crowd grew larger. People murmured Ebony's name, unsure if she really was the mayor. A few recognized her voice from televised addresses. The chaos escalated when a second patrol car arrived, two officers stepping out, perplexed by the scene of their colleague pinning a woman to the pavement as bystanders shouted that she was the mayor. "Derek, what's going on?" one of the newly arrived officers asked, wide-eyed, but Mulligan doubled down, determined to arrest Ebony. Click, click, click. Camera shutters and phone recordings proliferated. In real time, evidence was building. Not just a single perspective, but dozens. Mulligan had no idea how thoroughly the world would soon see his downfall. Just a mile away, in Chicago's historic City Hall, Ebony's staff was in a frenzy. 10 minutes earlier, a frantic call had come from a local resident claiming the mayor's being tackled by a cop on the south side. The staffer who took the call panicked, believing it was a hoax, until multiple calls poured in, each more urgent than the last. Deputy Mayor Alexis Grant took charge. She'd been Ebony's right-hand confidant since the election campaign. Immediately, Alexis grabbed her phone and tried calling Ebony's personal cell. No answer. She tried Ebony's security detail, only to find out Ebony had given them the slip that morning. The detail members, worried, mobilized to find her. The scenario was unthinkable. Ebony, physically assaulted by her own police force, and in broad daylight. Alexis prayed it wasn't true, but as the news aggregator Feed Chicago lit up with citizen videos, her worst fears were confirmed. One horrifying clip clearly showed Ebony pinned under Mulligan, handcuffed, shouting her name. Alexis recognized Ebony's voice, her trademark accent. The city's vow to protect its citizens was being violated in the cruelest manner, and the target was the very person who had sworn an oath to lead and protect them all. At the scene, the two officers who had arrived quickly sensed something was off. They noticed the onlookers pointing at Ebony's face, crying out, "Look, that's her. It's the mayor." The claim sounded absurd. Why would the mayor be dressed so casually in this area alone? Yet as they approached Mulligan, they recognized Ebony's features. One officer, Perez, felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. He'd seen Mayor King multiple times at official events. Her distinct eyes, her posture, even in distress, were unmistakable. "Derek, let her up," Officer Perez said in a hushed tone, stepping closer. "Back off," Mulligan snapped, still kneeling on Ebony. She let out a grunt of pain. "Derek, that might actually be the mayor," the other officer, Kowalski, murmured, voice trembling. "She looks exactly like Ebony King." Mulligan froze, confusion washing over him, then anger. "You've got to be kidding me." Officer Perez gently placed a hand on Mulligan's shoulder. "Let her up," he repeated. "We can confirm her ID without manhandling her. If that really is Ebony King." His voice trailed off, the implication dire. Skepticism still burned in Mulligan's gaze. "Fine," he hissed, "but if she's lying, I want her booked." He released his hold, yanking Ebony to her feet. The crowd surged, phones capturing every breath. Ebony's arms were still cuffed behind her, and tears of rage glossed her eyes. "Get these off me," she demanded, voice shaking. Mulligan hesitated before rummaging for the key. He unlocked the cuffs, ignoring the flurry of questions from the crowd and the deepening horror on the faces of his fellow officers. Ebony stood, shoulders stiff with pain. Her hoodie was dirty and torn, her palms scraped from the tumble. For a moment, she steadied herself, inhaling through clenched teeth. She glanced at the crowd, at the cameras recording every second. Then she turned her gaze on Mulligan, her expression a mix of heartbreak and fury. "Officer, the first told you who I was," she said, her voice low. "You just refused to listen." Mulligan opened his mouth, but no words came out. A flush crept across his cheeks. He still half believed Ebony was an imposter, staging some bizarre hoax. It can't be," he mumbled. "You were..." Ebony cut him off, pressing her throbbing shoulder. "Walking. That's all I was doing. You tackled me because you assumed." Her sentence went unfinished, but the implication was clear. He'd acted on a racist assumption. Officer Perez gently intervened, speaking to Ebony with the deference normally reserved for formal events. "Madam Mayor," he said, "we need to confirm your identity. Could we please see any form of ID?" Ebony exhaled shakily. She dug into her pocket for her wallet unlatched earlier by Mulligan's rough search. She held out her driver's license, featuring her name and photo. Perez inspected it, the color draining from his face. "Oh my God," he breathed. "It really is her." A hush fell over the street. In that silence, Ebony's phone rang. The caller ID read Deputy Mayor Alexis Grant. Ebony ignored the call for now. There were more pressing matters like a racist cop and a city about to erupt with outrage. While Ebony's identity was being confirmed at the scene, social media exploded with footage of the confrontation. Platforms like Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok buzzed with short clips, each more shocking than the last. The mayor pinned, the cop ignoring her protests, bystanders shouting in horror. Hashtags like #mayor tackled and #Chicago in crisis began trending. Local news stations, including ABC7 and WGN-TV, jumped on the story. Within minutes, they cut into their regular programming to show the viral videos. On-air personalities wore stunned expressions, uncertain how to frame the bizarre narrative of a mayor tackled by one of her own officers. City Hall's phone lines lit up. Citizens raged at the blatant disrespect, while others demanded to know if Ebony was safe. Activists who had long criticized the Chicago Police Department saw this as a turning point, a stark validation of their accusations about racial profiling and undue force. In living rooms across the city, families and friends huddled around screens, watching Ebony's ordeal on repeat. Some wept at the sight of such violence. Others seethed, resolved that something had to change. As the footage spread nationwide, Chicago's reputation was on the line, and Mulligan, unwittingly, had become the poster child for institutional prejudice and abuse of power. By the time Ebony's security detail arrived, the street was awash with flashing lights from multiple squad cars. Senior officers began cordoning off the area, urging bystanders to step back, though the crowd only grew. The tension soared as Ebony, still rubbing her bruised shoulder, fixed her gaze on Mulligan. He stood near his car, wrestling with shock and disbelief. Sergeant Hall, who oversaw Mulligan's precinct, arrived and quickly pulled Ebony aside. "Madam Mayor," Hall whispered, "are you all right?" "Do I look all right?" Ebony hissed, eyes blazing. "He tackled me, refused to believe me, humiliated me. And he's done it to others." Hall swallowed hard, nodding. "We'll handle this internally. Let's get you medical attention and—" In a moment, Ebony interrupted, scanning the crowd. She spotted a teen who had been filming. "You," she called, "did you get everything on camera?" He nodded, wide-eyed. "Yes, ma'am, from start to finish." "Send me a copy," Ebony said, handing him her official card. The teen trembled, starstruck that the mayor was speaking to him, but also fueled by righteous anger. He promised to share the clip. Then Ebony turned to Hall. "No more brushing things under the rug," she said. "This isn't just going away with an internal review. Mulligan's going to face a full investigation today." Hall bowed his head, feeling the gravity of the moment. Mulligan stood a few yards away, overhearing parts of the conversation. Panic flickered across his face. For years, he'd navigated the system with impunity. Now, that system was about to turn on him. Paramedics arrived to examine Ebony. While one tended to her scrapes and bruises, another shone a light into her eyes to check for a concussion. She grimaced, impatient with the fuss, yet she understood the necessity. If she were any other citizen, she'd likely be heading to the hospital in an ambulance, and any potential injuries could be more severe. Mulligan hovered nearby, flanked by Officer Perez and Kowalski, who looked ill at ease. The hush that settled around them spoke volumes. They were all complicit witnesses now. Once Ebony was cleared, she refused transport to the hospital, instead insisting on a trip to City Hall. "I need to address my staff and the public immediately," she declared. Mulligan's eyes darted around. He couldn't bring himself to apologize. Instead, he mumbled to Sergeant Hall, "I was just doing my job." Hall gave him a cold stare. "I suggest you remain silent and wait for your union rep. This is bigger than you realize." The paramedics finished, and Ebony rose. The crowd parted for her, a wave of anxious respect. Phones still captured every motion. In the distance, the wail of more sirens signaled additional reinforcements, perhaps unnecessary but emblematic of the chaos swirling around them. Mulligan felt the city's judgment bearing down. The ride to City Hall was brief but tense. Ebony allowed her security detail to escort her in a black SUV, ignoring the stares from passers-by who recognized her disheveled attire. By the time she entered the stately building, word had spread. The mayor was attacked by one of her own officers. Her staff, waiting anxiously in the marble foyer, gasped at her torn hoodie and scuffed face. Deputy Mayor Alexis Grant rushed over, eyes brimming with relief and alarm. "Madam Mayor, are you okay?" Ebony pulled Alexis into a quick hug. "I'm sore, but I'll live. We need a press conference immediately." Alexis nodded, guiding Ebony toward the large conference room on the second floor. The hallway buzzed with aides, city officials, and journalists who had arrived within minutes of hearing the news. Ebony could feel the weight of their shocked gazes. Reaching the conference room, Ebony paused. She smoothed her messy braids as best she could, took a sip of water, and steadied herself. This was no time for fear or anger to overshadow her responsibilities. She had to bring clarity, demand accountability, and ensure her ordeal would bring long-term change. After a moment's composure, she pushed the doors open, determined to turn her personal trauma into a transformative moment for the city. The conference room was packed with reporters, cameras, and city council members. Photographers snapped relentless photos of Ebony's ripped clothing and bruised skin. She stepped up to the podium, her deputy mayor at her side, the city seal displayed on the wall behind her. Clearing her throat, Ebony began. "Chicago, this afternoon, I had an experience that no citizen should ever have to endure. While walking through one of our neighborhoods in plain clothes, I was violently detained by Officer Derek Mulligan." Her voice wavered for a split second, but she steadied it. "He refused to believe I was the mayor, dismissed my pleas, and tackled me to the ground." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Ebony continued, "I want to be clear. This isn't about me. Yes, I was humiliated, but the real issue is how many times this has happened to others, those without a platform, without the ability to speak up and be heard. How many voices have gone ignored? How many cases swept under the rug?" She paused, letting her words resonate. Camera flashes intensified, and reporters jotted furiously on notepads. Her eyes scanned the room, locking briefly with a few city council members who had always seemed lukewarm on police reform. The tension was palpable. "As mayor, I promise a full, transparent investigation. Officer Mulligan has been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a formal inquiry. But more importantly, we will begin a thorough review of the Chicago Police Department's use of force policies." Her final words ignited a flurry of questions. Ebony raised a hand to indicate she wasn't done. A hush fell again, everyone sensed. This was just the beginning. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Mulligan sat in a cramped office, waiting for the union representative. A few of his fellow officers cast wary glances his way, as if he were radioactive. The entire department was abuzz with the scandal of the century, Mulligan tackling the mayor. He scrolled through his phone, seeing countless notifications, text messages from colleagues, family, and people he hadn't heard from in years, all in disbelief. On social media, he was public enemy number one. Clips of the incident had gone national. CNN and MSNBC were running loops of Ebony pinned under Mulligan. Finally, a stern-faced man named Henry Sykes from the police union entered. "Derek, we have a serious problem," Sykes began, dropping a stack of papers on the desk. "The mayor's press conference is all over TV. She's calling for an investigation. They're also digging into your past complaints." Mulligan's face tightened. "I was doing my job," he insisted, voice taut. "She was acting suspicious, couldn't see who she was." Sykes sighed. "That excuse won't fly. The world saw you ignore her, please. They heard her say she was the mayor. Even if you doubted her identity, the level of force used is questionable." "What do I do?" Mulligan asked, desperation creeping in. Sykes frowned. "We fight the administrative charges, but you have to brace yourself. The city's outraged, the mayor's outraged, and the media is calling this a blatant example of racist profiling. You're in for the fight of your life." Mulligan sank into the chair, feeling the enormity of his predicament. The protective bubble he once enjoyed had burst in the most catastrophic way possible. Back at City Hall, Ebony concluded her press conference by laying out immediate steps: Mulligan's suspension, a citizen hotline for reporting excessive force, and an external oversight committee that would review complaints against the Chicago Police Department. She also vowed to address the outdated training protocols that often led to aggressive policing in marginalized neighborhoods. City officials who once resisted reform felt public pressure mounting. Phone calls and emails poured in from constituents, demanding swift action. Activist groups organized a demonstration outside the precinct where Mulligan worked, holding signs that read, "Justice for all, not just the mayor, and racist cops out." Late that night, Ebony and Alexis pored over official data in the mayor's office. Complaints filed against Mulligan spanned years, allegations from stop and frisk incidents, unnecessary force, and intimidation. Many were dismissed or unfounded. Ebony's eyes welled with frustration. "This should never have gotten to this point," she muttered. "He should have been fired long ago." Alexis nodded. "The union's influence runs deep, but public outrage is stronger now than ever. We have a chance to break this cycle." Ebony gazed at the city lights from her office window, reflecting on how ironically her own painful experience might become a catalyst for real change. She resolved to press forward no matter the political blowback. In the following days, an independent review board comprising civil rights lawyers, retired judges, and community representatives was convened. They subpoenaed body camera footage, 911 call logs, and internal reports. They also interviewed witnesses who had recorded the incident and scoured Mulligan's history of complaints. Despite Mulligan's attempts to justify his actions, the board found glaring inconsistencies. Bodycam footage, though partially obstructed when Mulligan tackled Ebony, caught enough audio, Ebony identifying herself, Mulligan ignoring her, and the audible crowd yelling, "She's the mayor!" The board also discovered Mulligan had his camera turned off for several minutes before the scuffle, a violation of departmental rules. News of the investigation's progress trickled out, each new detail fueling public anger. Talk radio shows and local op-eds excoriated Mulligan and demanded a systemic overhaul. Rival politicians, seeing an opportunity to critique Ebony's leadership, ironically found themselves overshadowed by Ebony's decisive stance. Her poll numbers rose, fueled by widespread support for her transparency and determination. All the while, Ebony juggled her usual mayoral duties, budget meetings, community outreach, and planning committees while coping with the aftermath of her very personal assault. The bruises on her body were healing, but the deeper wound to her faith in her own police force spurred her forward relentlessly. When the Independent Review Board recommended that Mulligan face disciplinary action and possibly criminal charges, Tempers flared at the police union headquarters. Union President Ronald Greene held a press conference of his own, accusing the mayor of grandstanding and conducting a witch hunt against a dedicated officer. "We stand by Officer Mulligan," Greene declared to the cameras. He was following standard procedure. "This is all political," but Ebony fired back swiftly, pointing out that Mulligan's track record showed a persistent disregard for civil rights. She reminded the public that no one, not even a mayor, should be tackled without cause, pinned down, and humiliated simply because of skin color and clothing choice. Legal experts weighed in on national media outlets like CNN. Some argued Mulligan might face battery charges or a civil lawsuit. Others anticipated the union would fight tooth and nail, possibly dragging this case through court for years. Behind the scenes, Ebony consulted attorneys about the feasibility of pressing charges herself. The city's legal team was split. Some advised her to focus on internal department reforms, while others believed the mayor had a moral obligation to set a precedent by filing an official complaint. Ebony was still deliberating, but her inclination was to ensure Mulligan faced more than administrative discipline. There had to be a new standard of accountability. Under mounting public pressure and new evidence from the review board, the district attorney's office decided to press misdemeanor assault charges against Mulligan. The announcement drew cheers from many citizens who viewed it as a long overdue step toward justice. Union President Greene blasted the decision, vowing to defend Mulligan vigorously in court. When Mulligan was asked to surrender himself at the Cook County Courthouse for booking, the media swarmed. Cameras flashed as Mulligan arrived with his lawyer. Gone was the bravado he once displayed on the streets. His face was drawn, and he refused to answer reporters' shouted questions. For Ebony, who watched this unfold from her office, the moment was bittersweet. She took no pleasure in seeing a city official arrested, yet she recognized that accountability was the only path forward. If nothing else, Mulligan's case highlighted the urgent need for better hiring practices, comprehensive background checks, and robust disciplinary systems within the police force. As Mulligan was led into the courthouse for fingerprinting, Ebony steeled herself for the next phase. Pressing charges was one thing, securing a conviction and driving meaningful reform was another entirely. In the weeks leading up to Mulligan's preliminary hearing, Ebony introduced a wide-ranging police reform package to the City Council. The proposal included mandatory de-escalation training, civilian oversight committees with real authority, and measures to ensure body cams remained active during every encounter. She also pushed for a public database of complaints, so problematic officers like Mulligan couldn't hide behind sealed records. Council sessions turned heated. Some conservative members felt Ebony was anti-police and argued the reforms would hamper officers from doing their jobs. But the wind of public sentiment was behind the mayor. Testimonies from community members who had endured similar or worse abuse than Ebony brought many councillors to tears. Polls showed that a majority of Chicago residents across different neighborhoods and demographics supported the reforms. In a dramatic late-night vote, the council approved the package. Cheers erupted in the chamber. Ebony, sitting in her seat, silently wept with relief. She knew this was just a beginning, but it was a monumental step toward building the kind of city she'd promised on the campaign trail. Outside, activists celebrated, chanting her name. Yet Ebony remained resolute. "We've set a new course," she told her supporters, "but the work to change hearts and minds continues." Eventually, Mulligan's criminal trial got underway in a packed courtroom. The prosecution played videos from the day of the assault clips that looped Ebony's voice declaring her identity and Mulligan ignoring it. Witnesses testified about the racially charged language Mulligan had used in the past and described how frightened Ebony looked pinned beneath him. Mulligan's defense relied heavily on the argument that Ebony was non-compliant and that Mulligan had feared for his safety. They tried to paint Ebony as resisting arrest, but the video evidence blatantly contradicted that narrative. The jury deliberated for 2 days. In the end, they found Mulligan guilty of misdemeanor assault. The judge sentenced him to community service, a fine, and probation. Though some critics deemed the punishment too lenient, it was still unprecedented for a police officer in Chicago to face criminal conviction for on-duty actions. After the verdict, Ebony released a measured statement. "Let this outcome serve as a reminder that no one is above the law. But it must also inspire us to continue reform. True justice isn't just about penalizing one officer. It's about preventing abuses from happening in the first place." Months later, the city felt different, wounded but healing. Mulligan's case had catalyzed a re-evaluation of policing. While cynics predicted the reforms would stall, Ebony's administration pushed forward, funding community programs, hosting open forums between officers and residents, and inviting activist groups to shape future policies. On an early summer afternoon, Ebony revisited the same neighborhood where Mulligan had tackled her. This time, she arrived openly as the mayor, greeted by warm smiles. Kids who once eyed officers warily now played basketball on a court refurbished through a city grant. Murals that once displayed the city's cultural icons had been restored, vibrant with new paint. One local resident approached Ebony, hugging her gently. "Thank you for not giving up on us," she said. "After what happened, you could have just stayed away, but you came back." Ebony smiled, her heart full of gratitude and resolution. "This is my city," she replied simply. "I'm here to serve you." Stepping back into her car, Ebony recalled the painful memory of Mulligan pinning her down. It wasn't a memory she'd ever forget, but out of that horror arose a renewed sense of purpose. The lessons of that day echoed, reminding her of the work still to be done, and in that reflection she felt hope bloom for Chicago's future. In the end, it took a racist cop tackling the mayor in disguise to shock an entire city into confronting its own brokenness. By dismissing Ebony King's identity and using brutal force, Officer Mulligan not only exposed a culture of unchecked power, but also sparked a wave of reforms that transformed Chicago's approach to policing. What began as a terrifying personal ordeal for Ebony became a clarion call for transparency, accountability, and empathy within law enforcement. Thanks to unwavering community voices and political will, new policies ensured no one would suffer as she did again. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, share it with everyone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a spotlight on injustice and courage. Your support fuels our mission to inform, inspire, and empower communities everywhere. Thank you for watching together. Let's keep pushing for real change.